All right. So, as Denise was saying, we almost 50 years ago, we passed something called Proposition 20. And so we're coming up on the 50th anniversary in 2022 of that citizen-led initiative that really put in place one of the most powerful and successful coastal management programs on the planet. Not to talk a lot about that detail, but these were the two core ideas in that proposition. One, that the coastal zone is distinct and valuable, but it belongs to all the people. So that's a core idea. And the other core idea was we want to protect it not just for ourselves, but for present and future generations. So at the time, in the environmental movement, right in the heart of it, a few years after the Santa Barbara spill, these were really critical ideas that were formative in that initial stage of the environmental protection movement and coastal protection. So out of that proposition, we created something called the California Coastal Plan. And that really was the first 4 years of looking at the entire coast. What are the issues? What are the resources that we like to protect? And what should we do about it going forward? And that was passed to the legislature, who then passed the Coastal Act in 1972. But you see the question that they framed in 76 was, shall the coast be abused, degraded, eroded, or shall it be used intelligently for future generations? And so that's been the grand experiment now for almost 50 years. Have we achieved that, or do we have some work to do? And I think it's a little bit of both, which hopefully I'll be able to touch on in different ways. So this Coastal Act, as most of you know, set out a broad array of policies and things that we care about on our coast. And these are all the different policy areas that are addressed by the Act, from resource protection to maintaining priority land uses to protecting coastal agriculture, special communities, etc. And so it was a pretty broad law, but also very powerful. And I've argued that it's actually been pretty successful in achieving many of those objectives. And so I'm just going to briefly fly through some of that. One of the core ideas was we basically froze the urban footprint along our coastline for much of the coast. And so you can look at places like Cambria in 1972 in this photo, and you see the same exact urban-rural boundary. We just did a lot of development inside the urban area, which is what the Coastal Act told us to do. So you can keep developing, but keep it to where we've already developed. That's Dillon Beach, 40 years of no change on the boundary. Cayucos, same story. Pismo Beach, same story. So we've been pretty successful by putting in place strong growth management policies and sticking to it, and not developing in the rural and agricultural areas. Public access, which everybody on this call probably knows a lot about, has been one of the big successes of the Coastal Act. And we said in 76, we want to protect and maximize access to and along the shoreline for everyone and for the future. But that hasn't been an easy undertaking. There's been huge battles that we've fought and are still fighting to try to achieve that goal. This is one of the most infamous battles, perhaps, the Geffen access in Malibu, where there was a 20-year battle litigation just to open this accessway, which was required in a prior permit in the early 80s. And here's a before and after of that beach, which is now theoretically maximally available to everybody when these accessways are open. We can talk about red curbs later if you want. Somebody mentioned there was a little red curb activity going on down there. But our access program has been so successful that for a while there, it was a theme in the Doonesbury strip, a series of comics about not only the battle generally, but the Geffen accessway. And this is just one example where Zonker's realizing that access is not the law, but that mansion owners are a law unto themselves on the California coast. So this big battle was written about in the LA Times, and I think it's on the call tonight, and really became renowned around the world. Of course, we've used that law to achieve access in a lot of places that ordinarily we wouldn't have access if things were left to the system. And so we've had access at the Montage Resort, you see on the upper left. We've got access at the fifth hole in Stillwater Cove at Pebble Beach. You can go in there, you can park right around here, walk in and enjoy that beach. And we've even got access all these green trails at the Trump National Golf Course. So nobody's above the coastal access obligations. Of course, as I mentioned, we still have a lot of battles going on. This is Martins Beach in San Mateo County, where there's still an ongoing dispute about historic access from Highway 1 down to this beach here. That remains to be seen how that's going to play out. And of course, Hollister Ranch has been in the news the last couple of years, and now we're in the middle of a stakeholder process trying to plan maximum access. But these disputes are all raising the same kinds of questions. Who should be able to access the coast, how and how much, and what are the trade-offs, and the balancing with private property and with resource protection, all of those issues. But we've been very successful to date, I think, even though we haven't finished the job, and I don't know what we'll ever finish. Anyway, this is my Avengers transition slide. So meanwhile, back on the planet Earth, while we've been doing all this great coastal protection, everything else is going to hell in a handbasket. So, you know, temperature's going up, CO2 is going up, the heat's going up, fisheries are in decline, plastic production is going up, global extinctions are on the rise. And now this year, we're down to 10 years, apparently, before we need to make drastic reductions in our CO2 emissions before we go past this point of no return in terms of some of the climate change objectives. So we're really in a world of hurt environmentally, globally, which I think, you know, requires us to ask, what are we doing along the coast, and are there things we need to change or revisit in order to do a better job? Socially, there's some other changes that have been happening, and of course our population in California is continuing to rise, although it has tapered off in terms of its rate in recent years. But you can see this pretty much at World War II is when population growth took off in California. And by the late 1960s, we were all clamoring for some kind of coastal protection. So a direct relationship to how many people were coming to the coast and using it. We're also becoming more diverse as a population. And that's had a lot of implications for equity issues and deciding who gets to use what kinds of resources, where, how accessible they are, et cetera. And so that's definitely a re-emerging theme. I'll come back to that idea of re-emergence. And then the other social justice dimension in my mind is just the incredible inequity in the distribution of wealth. And so this was one study that came out a year or so ago showing that the wealth gap in the United States is now as bad as it was back in the 1920s. So we're back to those kinds of differences in who has the wealth. So what does all this mean for the coast? Well, one of the things I think it means is we need to think a little more carefully about the role of the Coastal Act in oil development and CO2 emissions. And this is just one example, but there was a couple of years ago, the Los Cerritos wetlands issue came up, and the question was basically, should oil development be allowed to continue in a consolidated form in the Los Cerritos wetlands, or should there not be allowed in order to curtail CO2 emissions from oil production? One of the arguments for doing this was that there would be a restoration project with the consolidated oil development. Well, I think one of the interesting points that was in the information there was that even though we would have this restoration of the wetlands in Los Cerritos, if you project out sea level rise, that wetland system that was restored would basically convert to a mudflat over the next 50 to 100 years. So the value of that restoration is really in question, I think. In any case, the Coastal Commission did end up approving that project, but they didn't do it because they found that it was consistent with some of the policies of the Act. They did it because there's a policy in the Act that allows an override of an inconsistent project for if various findings can be made, and if you find that that project is in the public welfare. So in this case, they used that override because they found that this project would be inconsistent with the Coastal Act, except that the trade-off, the wetland restoration in exchange for a consolidated, more defined oil production project, was worth making. That was the rationale. this provision that is in there for oil and gas development is an artifact of the 1970s. And so one of the things that was happening when we passed the Coastal Act was the energy crisis. And that we have a number of policies in the Act that reflect that notion that we need to provide for oil and gas development along the shoreline and give it special treatment. Well, I think the time for that kind of a policy is long gone. And so one of the things we need to think about is just getting rid of that policy and not putting ourselves in the position to have to make those trade-offs when the planet is in such a dire situation in terms of CO2 and petroleum development. That's a photo from the UC Santa Barbara Library did a special on the oil spill anniversary. So they were asking all of us to take a photo with the "Get Off Oil" sign. Anyway, another social trend that we all are familiar with in California is the value of our homes, right? And how much real estate costs. This is the trend in the median home value in California. But what's striking is when you put on other curves of coastal communities relative to this curve, that it flattens out. So now you got the statewide median value down here versus, say, for example, the Santa Barbara median value, 1.1 million, Venice Beach, 2.2 million almost, and up here is Malibu, over 3 million. So our coastal real estate is even that much more valuable and sets up an immediate situation where the people who are able to live along the coast are the ones that have the money. Well, some of you may remember the original vision for coastal access in the Prop 20 and in the coastal plan was that we should have well-maintained, older, less expensive housing that provides opportunities for people of all incomes to live near the ocean. Now, this was a public access policy, an affordable housing policy, because we recognized that access was not just about getting to the coast and being at the coast, but actually being able to live on the coast and enjoy and experience it. That's why we had a Coastal Act policy at the time that said lower cost visitor and recreational facilities and housing opportunities shall be protected and provided. Well, that was going pretty well. The Coastal Commission required a lot of inclusionary housing units over 4 years. Up to 5,000 affordable units, many of them built. Demolition of existing affordable units were routinely denied. Millions of dollars in lieu fees for affordable housing was required. So we were taking that idea seriously. Yeah, everybody should be able to live in the coastal zone. Well, of course, it was working so well, the legislature removed that provision from the Coastal Act in 1981 on the brink of the beginning of the Reagan Revolution, and we had Duke Majan in Sacramento who hated the Coastal Act and the Coastal Commission. So it was a complete backlash to a successful affordability provision along our coast. So now it's routine that what we see along the coast is houses like these bungalows in 1972 in Santa Cruz just becoming bigger and better and more expensive mansions. These particular houses here are valued at $3 million, $8 million, and $5.5 million recently. So we don't have any way to assure any kind of affordability in the coastal zone. Because there are no restrictions on that. So this question of who is able to access, is it equitable? Do we need more affordable ways to access the coast has become front and center again, and in more recent years been married with this environmental justice notion also, that we need to think about how to make the coast equally available for everyone. So the question in my mind is the coastal zone boundary really an economic border fence that is preventing an equitable distribution of those coastal resources? Another trend that, of course, we're all familiar with right now and that came up this year is this COVID pandemic. And it's been interesting to me to see how this pandemic has really put our shoreline and our beach resources front and center in the public debate, not just in California, but across the country. As people want to be at the beach, they want to be outside, but we've had this challenge with the restrictions. So I was fortunate to be able to participate in a task force that Surfrider put together, and we had worked together on some recommendations about how to think about beach access in light of the pandemic. You probably have seen it. And I think that was a really important effort on the part of Surfrider to be leading on this kind of a question, because obviously it's put a lot of stress on a lot of people, and it still is. In fact, Santa Cruz County is going back to its heart of the pandemic restrictions for the Labor Day weekend to make sure that there's not an inordinate amount of people here. So that brings me to the big elephant in the room, the sea level rise and climate change, and I'll spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about that, and then maybe we can get into some questions about whatever you have in mind. Every time we turn around, sea level rise is projected to be worse than we thought it was going to be. So that every time we have a new study about what's happening with the ice melting or how the shoreline is reacting to climate change, it seems like we're in a difficult place. The most recent state recommendation has us potentially having 10 feet or more of sea level rise by 2100. That's a low probability scenario, but it's premised on the uncertainty around how the ice is going to actually melt, because it is going to melt. It's a question about how much and how quick. So these are some of the recent statistics about what that is going to mean for our coastal resources. Submergence of about 83% of our tidal wetlands, 55% of our coastal habitat area vulnerable to 5 feet of sea level rise. And the one that I've focused more on is the 2/3 of Southern California beaches may disappear by 2100. So significant impacts to, in particular, the beaches of California, something that we all know is a core value and just a part of our culture. Now, this is the original foundation of the Half Moon Bay Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay. It's called the Sunken Cathedral, and it was sticking out of the bluff. And I remember the first time I walked around the corner here on the beach and I saw this thing sticking out of the coast, and I thought of that the original Planet of the Apes movie. If you've seen that, in the scene at the end of the movie where Charlton Heston rounds the corner and he sees a Statue of Liberty sticking out of the beach, and he says, "Oh my God, what have we done?" And really concerned about this legacy of what humans have done to the planet. And so one of the reasons I find this issue so interesting and challenging is because it really is about a legacy of how we treat our coastline and what's going to be left here in the future, or what we're leaving currently. And we already know that this problem of coastal erosion is real, that this idea that there's a coastal squeeze when you have a hard back beach and a rising tide or an eroding shoreline is real. This is a Malibu surf competition a couple summers ago, where you can see there's very little space left for people to actually use that beach productively. Some of you may recognize these emergency boulders here that were put down to try to protect the famous wall from attack from erosion. I'm not sure what the latest is on that project. So a lot of communities have now been studying the vulnerability of their shorelines based on what we know about sea level rise and projections. This is one slide from the recent City of Dana Point assessment, which gives you a summary view of some of the projections and the impacts. Like, it's a little hard to see, but there's a shoreline retreat line, which is back here somewhere. At this scale, you really can't tell what's going on. So if you zoom in on some of the projections data, this is an overhead of a section of Capistrano Beach, where you can see this in theory is the current shoreline, the blue, but these are projected shorelines in 2050, 2075, and 2100, assuming these levels of sea level rise. So this yellow line, shoreline, is assuming about 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100. You can see there isn't any beach left in that scenario, right? So all things considered, if we do nothing here and we hold the line on the road at least, or maybe the railway, there isn't going to be any beach. So this is squarely raising a question of, well, is that okay? And if not, what are we going to do about it? The problem is huge and difficult because we've really set up a development pattern that predates the Coastal Act. So even though we have this amazing law, by the time we passed it, most of the urban areas had already established their development patterns. This is Santa Cruz County, 1943, right in the World War II. 1967, basically built out. So we cast the die before we decided to do something about protecting the coast. And up and down the coast, you can see that we've built in some really dumb places, right? We like to build on sand spits. We like to build right on the beach. We like to build at the mouths of estuaries and rivers. These are inherently hazardous places that are not going to be stable over the long run, even without sea level rise, but particularly with sea level rise. So we've got a really difficult task ahead of us. How do we deal with these development patterns that are not natural? Or maybe they are human natural. This is a shot of Pacifica has gotten a lot of attention in recent years, but this is a shot of the main Rockaway Beach in Pacifica in the mid-1930s. You can see there's a developed back dune system here. We had just started to see some development behind that dune system, but this is what it looks like today. That's basically the same viewpoint. So you can see, I think this building right here is that building. So you can see we decided that it was okay to develop here. And this is what we have now. We've had to protect it with a revetment. There's a revetment down here protecting the parking lot. You have a beach here, but there is no beach now that we've stopped the natural erosion process. So I used a really high-powered graphics program to show where the beach should be if we didn't have that development there. You could imagine that all things left to their own devices, that nature would have maintained a beach at this location. But that's not an uncommon problem. We see that all up and down the coast, and you guys are more familiar with that than most. The other thing about the Coastal Act that we passed is that it did provide for the protection of development that was existing at the time of the act. And so one of the inevitable consequences of that is we've seen the gradual proliferation of seawalls, because the law essentially says, if you were here when we passed this protective law, you can have a seawall, assuming you meet certain conditions. So this is just one example, Solana Beach, where we had this beautiful cliff geology in 1989, and it's gradually incrementally turned into this faux Disneyland kind of landscape, right, where we try to replicate the natural bluff form and do what we can to make it look okay. But you know, it's not okay when if you really appreciate this. But anyway, this expansion has been hard to stop. We also know what seawalls do to the beach. This is not rocket science. We know that if you build a hard structure and try to hold the line, you're going to narrow the beach. The beach wants to be here, not here. So that's what happens. This is a pre-Coastal Act hotel in Monterey. One of the reasons apparently we have the Coastal Act. We know all those developments where they are. This is another example. This beach was a continuous, laterally accessible beach in Moss Beach in 1972. Since then, these homes here have put in revetments to protect themselves. This, what was a vacant lot at the time and is now developed, doesn't have a seawall. You can see there's a beach here, but there isn't a beach here, right? It's not, again, it's not rocket science. That's what sand and water and erosion does, and rocks. This is an overhead of Capistrano Beach, which some of you are very familiar with. And again, you can see where the beach is, where there is no revetment, and where the beach is with the revetment. So it's not difficult to imagine what kind of coast we could have, depending on what we decide to do along that immediate shoreline. And I just put this sequence of slides in because they're cool and they're exciting to watch, and also dramatic. But this is the erosion in Pacifica that happened about a decade ago. In the space of about 10 days, lots of rain, upper bluff saturation, and over a course of a week, up to 89 feet of shoreline just slumped away down to the beach, right? And including taking several dogs with it. So it was a pretty dramatic loss of shoreline there. This is the section of coast. It's that shot was actually up on this area here to the left out of the screen, but this is the area that's gotten a lot of attention in the news, where these apartment buildings have been condemned. They couldn't be saved, even though riprap was thrown at the base of the toe of the bluff. They eventually were demolished, and now there's an empty space there. And so we talk about this as unplanned retreat. And I think a lot of our locations along the coast are going to be in this box. we're going to see retreat. It's just not, it's not going to be something that we plan actively and proactively to take on. So one of the challenges we have is, do we want to retreat in a rational way and more deliberately, or are we just going to let it fall apart, you know, as it happens? One of the things we've done pretty well under the Coastal Act is take this idea that new development should be safe. So even though there's this provision to protect existing, new development, it needs to be done in a way that in theory won't need a seawall. So we've used setbacks like this subdivision in Pismo Beach. And again, that's not rocket science. If there's a hazardous location due to erosion, maybe you should set yourself a little further back away from that hazard, right? And give yourself more time to have that development. We've refined that approach pretty aggressively in California, and for at least 20 years now, the Coastal Commission has been using something called a no future seawall condition, which in effect is a rolling easement because it says you can develop at this location, for in this case, for example, with a setback to account for maximum erosion. You can be there for as long as you can be there, but you will sign and record a deed restriction that says, I assume the risk of this hazardous location. I agree that I will never build a seawall. I will remove my house if it's required, and I'll work on the foundation and design to make sure that that's easily done. And so these provisions, in effect, put in a rolling easement that there will never be a seawall on that parcel. It remains to be seen how that's going to play out when the courts start getting involved and how effective that will be. But we've now got dozens and dozens of residential lots in California with that kind of a restriction on it. So stay tuned. We've also done a pretty good job regulating when we've had to approve seawalls, and that's gotten more refined. This is one of my favorite cases, although I hate the way the seawall looks. This is the Ocean Harbor House in Monterey. Some of you may recognize it from that television series, Big Little Lies. This is the location that one of the characters goes to hide out. And there's a great shot of the seawall in the show, unfortunately. Anyway, what the Coastal Commission did was, based on an analysis that this beach area would be lost over the 50-year life of this wall, they calculated an approximate $5 million fee for the recreational value of that beach area, about an acre. In addition to requiring that the applicants had offered this backup access for when the beach access is lost, that you can walk between the condominiums behind this first row here in order to keep walking along the coast. But we had said, well, that's not really adequate to offset the impact you're going to have on the coast. And so we required this fee. And those fees have become fairly routine, although the calculation of those fees is somewhat varied depending on the circumstances. This is that location at a recent king tide. So you can see that we're already in a situation where there's not a lot of beach depending on the tide conditions. So as you know, we've been doing this vulnerability assessment, and we're talking about adaptation planning, and we're talking about what are the different options we have to deal with that. And people tend to think about protection, the seawalls, or accommodation, like elevating this house in Stinson Beach, or retreating. And this is the example of Stillwell Hall in Monterey County, where we were successful at getting the Army to remove this revetment here in order to retreat it back when they demolished the facility. But of course, retreat is pretty controversial depending on where you are. Although I would note that Santa Barbara City just released an adaptation plan, which has an extensive discussion of managed retreat for its different areas in the city. At least they're dealing with it analytically. We'll see what happens when the political process starts up again. But places like Pacifica and Del Mar have said, no way, we're not retreating. You can't make us. No, we're not going to, forget it. And so we're in this situation where people are taking a step back and trying to figure out how to deal with that. Environmental justice impacts of eroding beaches, I think that's a real concern, but it's a broad social justice concern because it means that the only people that are going to be able to continue these coastal proximity locations are the ones that are living there. If you come to Broad Beach on most days now and you go to this public access like these kids did when I was here, you look down and this is what you see. There's no beach, it's water. Only at the lowest of tides do you have a beach at that location. So they turned around and they had to leave. And that's what's in store for many of our beaches in the near term. And then the big question, or one of the big questions in my mind, is what about the public trust and the fact that we, the people, own the coastal resources below the mean high tide? Those are state public trust lands. As that tide line moves inland with sea level rise, all of a sudden these houses in Malibu are going to be sitting on our land. And we're going to have to ask ourselves what we want to do about that. You guys can think about that. So let me go back to the cathedral for a minute. This is a shot of it from the air. It had started to fall apart in recent years and become a hazard. And so there was concern about maybe we should be removing it. And in fact, the city of Half Moon Bay did do that. They required the Ritz Hotel to come in with a crane and carefully take out the old caissons. Here they are down on the beach, and they took it away. That was a function of an early retreat condition that the Coastal Commission had required in the early 90s. The interesting question is, what are we going to do when that condition starts to kick in with the hotel itself? That should be a really interesting debate. So to me, the question is really, so challenging that we need to tax our imaginations and think about creatively what are the alternatives that will enable us to keep things in a way that meets our desire to have a beach and access and a beach ecology and shoreline resources, and also provide for shoreline development in some way. If you saw the movie Blade Runner 2049, you may remember the scene where he lands down in front of this huge seawall. And so I looked up the backstory on that scene, and they call it the Sepulveda seawall. Sepulveda, of course, is pretty far inland in LA, and that would be quite something if that's the future in 2050, to have a huge seawall running along Sepulveda at the edge of the ocean. I think we're not going to be quite there yet, but the vision, you get the idea that we can imagine some pretty awful scenarios. In my mind, the question is, can we also imagine some pretty different scenarios? And I don't want to know that the future of our beaches is simply going to be views from underneath elevated houses, for example. We need to come up with some other alternative. People are starting to think a little bit outside the box, and I know there's a question, I think, in the wings about groins. This is an emergency effort at Goleta Beach in the last couple of years, and you can see the way they put the debris out into the surf zone was perpendicular, like a groin. In effect, it formed a little groin, although it kind of curved around, and by the end of the replenishment or the deposition of the debris, this beach had formed. And so that was one of the theories, I think, behind the way they did this emergency permit, recognizing that it hasn't actually been permitted by the Coastal Commission in any kind of permanent form. But now we've got this mini groin out here at Goleta Beach, making a beach for at least the northerly half of that, or upper half of that beach. One of my favorite cases, and then I'll wrap up, was an effort we made to realign Highway 1 in Pedras Blancas. And granted, it's a little bit of an easier situation. It's working with public agencies, Caltrans. They came in 1997 to get this emergency revetment because Highway 1 was literally starting to fall into the ocean. We, of course, said, well, that's important to protect Highway 1. And so, yes, you can have your emergency permit, but we want you to start planning to move the highway inland because we don't want to keep revetment there when you have the ability to do something else. Caltrans said, well, that's going to take us 15 years. And we said, fine, let's get started. And, I never really imagined that that would be part of my Coastal Commission career, but this project really did take 15 years and I lived it. So I was involved in this emergency permit and did the permit for that, and then saw the next 5-year permit come in and the next 5-year permit. And by the time I was the director, we did the permit for the realignment. They moved the highway. Here's the new alignment. The shoreline has started to restore itself. The old alignment has become part of the coastal trail. and habitat, new entities are moving in to take back the coast. So I'll stop with this slide, which is simply a paraphrase of Jane Jacobs' quote that says, you know, designing a dream shoreline is easy, but rebuilding it will take imagination. So I think we have our work cut out for us. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Lester. Very informative. I love the movie references. That was really cool. And what I love most is all the photos. I think
And to speak to the younger generation, you know, I have a 17-year-old daughter.
Okay, great. Yeah, but I really loved all the photos. That really helped tie everything together. It's one thing to talk about what's happening, but to see those visuals really helps to tie it all together. So thank you for all that. Again, if anybody has questions, pop them in the chat box. I'll see if maybe we could take some live questions also. And as you mentioned, I did get one question in advance that I will kick off with from Tom Cook down in San Diego. It's a few sentences, so bear with me. The use of groins has been proven to cause downdrift erosion. This is well established and mentioned in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Coastal Erosion Manual and most coastal engineering textbooks. A lot of this knowledge is based on over 100 years of data from the state of New Jersey, which is littered with groins. North Carolina has a law restricting the use of groins as coastal erosion devices, and researchers have said that this law has stopped the New Jersey-ification of North Carolina beaches. You recently co-authored a paper in Shore and Beach called Groins, Sand Retention, and the Future of Southern California's Beaches, where you make an argument for the increased use of groins as a way to stabilize beaches. This study has been applauded by coastal property owner groups who are often on the other side of the debate regarding the use of sediment retention devices, which Surfrider and to a large extent the California Coastal Mission have been critical of. Can you comment on what you and the co-authors were hoping to do with this paper and how you would address a coastal property owner who would want to use this paper to further their cause of hard structures for coastal protection?
Okay. I appreciate that somebody read the article, or at least they've heard about it. In my mind, I think if you read the article through, you'll see that it doesn't necessarily advocate for increased use of groins, as opposed to we should revisit where and under what conditions a groin might be appropriate as a strategy, adaptation strategy in any particular area. And so in my mind, when you look at different sections of the coast, and this is coming out in some of the vulnerability and adaptation planning studies that we're seeing, we may want to consider the short to midterm use of a groin-like structure in conjunction with sand replenishment as a strategy to buy us time for more proactive managed retreat over the long run. And you know, there are a lot of different competing values in these shoreline battles, but somewhat distilled down to the property owner interests versus those of us who want to be able to maintain a public space, including the recreation and ecological dimensions. But I don't see managed retreat happening overnight. And so we're starting to see the loss of beaches in places like Capistrano Beach or any really seriously urbanized area for that matter. In Santa Cruz County, there's hardly any beach in the midsection of the county because it's all revetments. So if there is a situation where you could use a groin, not in a situation like New Jersey or circumstances where it would lead to cumulative erosion on the down coast or this compartmentalization of the coastline, but rather more like a headland, and we have a lot of beaches that are formed by natural headland geography. That's what traps the sand and creates the beach. It may be worth considering, in my mind, much as beach replenishment might be worth considering, as an interim strategy while we figure out what to do in the longer run. The problem is, in some of these cases, even if you did manage retreat in some of these cases, you may not be able to have a beach because of the just the fear of physics of what's happening with sea level rise. And so the Santa Barbara study that was just completed makes that observation that at least the technical people there don't think that along their section of coast with the cliff, where they have cliffs in northern part of the city or up coast, that even if you did manage to retreat there, you're going to lose the beach because sea level rise rates will overtake the erosion rate of the cliff. So you've got all of these complicated scenarios, and only some of them would a groin make sense. Maybe there are very few of those, but I think, for example, one of the sites we make in the article is Broad Beach. And if you look at Broad Beach, if you've been there, I worked on that project when I was at the commission. The emergency revetment at Broad Beach went in 2010, 10 years ago. They've been working on that project for 10 years. They've been arguing among the residents. They can't get the sand. They couldn't find any sand for a long time to do the replenishment. Now they don't agree with each other about how much it's going to cost. It's not clear to me that there's ever going to be any beach there if we stick with that same strategy. But maybe if you had a long-term plan that involved maybe a groin at the end of that cell or that middle of that beach area, small groin. We're not talking about jetties, right? And that's another part of the article, is there's the difference between different kinds of structures, like that emergency permit I just showed. That's a pretty small structure, but it actually facilitated the creation of a beach for a while. Different kinds of groin technologies. I know that Dave Revel has looked at that kind of a cobble groin structures for Ventura County, possibly. Maybe you know about that, Bill. So there are different geophysical circumstances where a groin ought to be part of the consideration, I think. Not saying that there aren't impacts, but what are the trade-offs, right? If the trade-off is seawalls and no beach, then maybe we should think about it.
Yep, something to look at for sure. I think it may be location specific. Great. We have, looks like we have about 6 questions lined up. I put it on gallery view for a moment and was stoked to see world champion surfer Peter Townend out there with no coastal exploitation hat on. Love it, PT. Good to see you. But let's get on with the next question from Rick Erkeneff, who says, Surfrider Foundation had a video called Shifting Baselines. Yeah, I love it too, Mitch. That's a great one. And Charles, could you expand on the mean high tide line moving and how the Coastal Commission will define and redraw the maps?
Sure. I'm actually working on this project right now, which is focusing on this question of public trust and implications with sea level rise and what it might mean for management. So the mean high tide is, backing up, public trust lands are the tide lands that we, the public, own as part of California's original sovereignty. So it really comes from the federal law that says when California became a state, those lands became state lands up to the mean high tide. Now, what I mean by that line is we know there's an elevation of the ocean, but it intersects with the beach. And that line where it intersects, that elevation of the water, is the mean high tide line. That defines the public lands versus the inland uplands, which are often private lands, but they could be public if it's a state park, for example. So that line, it's always moving, right? We know how beaches ebb and flow, right? The winter beach is really back up against the back shoreline. The summer beach builds out. And so where that elevation of water intersects the beach is going to change seasonally and daily. It's always moving, and we call that an ambulatory line. But when you put on sea level rise, then not only is it moving back and forth, but it's going up gradually. And so gradually that moving back and forth is going to be moving inland, wherever that is. And that's the problem, is that we're going to confront situations increasingly where there's private development overlying that public trust land line. Now, it's more complicated. It would take a while to explain the details of how that line is actually calculated and many issues there, but We do have a state lands commission, so it's not necessarily the coastal commission, Rick, that's going to take the lead on this, maybe, and we'll see. But the state lands commission is the state agency that's responsible for issuing leases, for example, when we actually have development on state tidelands, like a pier or an offshore oil platform or any kind of development that needs to be on the tidelands, has to get a lease from the state lands commission and approval. State lands can also say no, you can't do that on tidelands, and there are legal principles about what kinds of uses are appropriate on tidelands. Generally speaking, they're the ones the Coastal Act says are okay. Public recreation, protection of resources, protection of the water, commercial fishing, public uses that have to use the tidelands. Residential development, commercial development are not some of those uses. So there's a clear distinction in the law that it's not okay for a private residential development to be on our state tidelands. We all know that those situations exist. And so the State Lands Commission gets into a box of deciding whether it's a significant impact or is there a sufficient public benefit to allow that residential encroachment onto the tidelands. And State Lands Commission has already been issuing leases for some seawalls, which happen to be in the Commission's judgment on those lands, our lands. So the interesting issue is how are we going to deal with that as it gets increasingly aggravated by rising tides? That house I showed in Stinson Beach, the tide line's just going to go right under that. There is an interesting case from the Ninth Circuit up in Washington, which made the conclusion that the mean high tide line does keep moving even if somebody builds a seawall. So that's yet to be played out in California, but could be an interesting way to think about that problem. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I think that was good. I see two questions here dealing with local coastal programs, so I'll kind of combine them together. The original vision, I think is supposed to be the original vision of the Coastal Act was for having up-to-date local coastal programs running the entire coast. What would that mean if it were achieved? And then the second question is, currently many LCP updates are delayed. What, in your opinion, is needed to get them approved? What is an ideal and realistic timeline given increasing interest in intermediate adaptation projects like groins?
Wow, good questions. One from a former commissioner. Hello. Those of you who know me know I spent a lot of wonky hours working on LCPs because, that's a really core idea in the Coastal Act and was one of the original political bargains. We'll have a Coastal Act, but the way we're going to get it agreed to by local government is to make sure that we pass some power to local government. And so the idea was the Coastal Commission would approve these plans, and those plans needed to have to be found as meeting the objectives of the state law. And if we do that, then you can do all the permits, at least the permits above the mean high tide. And so the Coastal Commission retains some jurisdiction over permits along the shoreline. It also has an appeal authority. But the theory was local governments would take responsibility for the daily permitting activities, but they would be constrained by a set of land use policies and zoning ordinances and other kinds of rules that the Coastal Commission decided were consistent with the state law. A simple example, the Coastal Act says protect wetlands and basically says you can't develop in wetlands. So a local coastal program needs to have a policy that says you can't develop in wetlands. And then it might have an ordinance that says you need to stay 100 feet away from wetlands. So these detailed rules of how are you going to implement the state requirement to not develop in wetlands. And then the appeal mechanism would be, well, if the local government approves a permit that doesn't respect that rule, the Coastal Commission can appeal it, or a citizen can appeal it, and the commission can decide something different, like follow your LCP. It says 100 feet, 100 feet says 100 feet. So that's the logic. The fact of the matter is it's taking a long time to get those approved, and when you don't have them approved, it means you're not looking at the resource questions in a more holistic context. So We do individual, which is what we're still doing with seawalls, right? We do seawalls one by one instead of looking at the larger community plan and how to deal with a community level vulnerability. We're dealing with these things as one-offs. And it's very hard to plan for an issue and regulate and manage shoreline erosion, for example, when you're taking that kind of an approach. So in the ideal, you'd have these plans in place, which local governments have now been starting to do, which look at the entire jurisdiction and decide what is the best strategy overall. And I think that relates to the question about the groins, for example, again, which is putting in place a series of strategies based on your plan that will be implemented over time. And in theory, will get you to the place that has been agreed to by most people as the place we want to be in that plan. So that's the purpose of an LCP. I'm not sure I hit everything in the question.
No, I think that was good. Next question is, clearly managed retreat will be needed to save many of our state's beaches. Do you have any idea of what a roadmap would look like to getting managed retreat law passed by our state government?
That's a great question. When I was with the Coastal Commission, one of the first things that, when I became the director, one of the first things that happened was legislators would ask me, well, what do we do? What kind of law can we pass? And my favorite response is, we have a law. It's called the Coastal Act. And it sets up this really cool process. You see, it's got all these really killer policies that say protect things, and then it tells you how to do plans to protect things, and then it tells you how to do permits in order to make sure you're meeting the plan to protect things. And you know, sometimes we get lost in the weeds, but I don't know if we need to change our fundamental laws so much as to implement them with certain objectives in mind. And so that's the big fight you've been seeing between, in some ways, the fight between Surfrider and private development interests in some cases, which is, well, what is the right outcome in this situation and what's consistent with the Coastal Act? Now, that said, I think every state is dealing with this problem, and they don't all have a Coastal Act. That we all have a variety of mechanisms. And if we're going to do managed retreat, we're going to need effective community-driven processes where people get a chance to understand what's happening with sea level rise, what are the options for dealing with it, who's going to win and lose. You know, most people don't even understand that the question of sea level rise and seawalls sets up this loss of a beach. They just see seawalls as, we need those to protect our development, but they don't understand what the implications of that are for everyone else. And so we need to work on that piece. And then we need to work on helping people be enabled to retreat. So I think the reaction against managed retreat is completely understandable. If you're a homeowner, any of you who own homes, imagine somebody asking you to figure out how you're going to leave your home. It's a difficult social problem, and so we need to work directly with owners, homeowners, local governments, and put in place policy incentives, but also financial incentives. Because one of the things that's happening in other parts of the country that are a little farther along this curve of climate change impacts, where there's lower elevations, Louisiana, Florida, North Carolina, you're already seeing real estate markets react to this trend. And so people are already losing their property values. The question is, what do we do about that situation? California is a little different because our property values are so high, and I'm not sure there are very many people who want to figure out how to help Malibu retreat, right? I don't want to pay for that. But the question is, in the East Coast, there are already communities that have retreated, and they, like the community of Oakwood, is well talked about. One of the communities in Staten Island, which got hit hard by Hurricane Sandy, and they were asking for state money to buy out their property so that they could leave their neighborhood in order to not have this happen again. California's in a little bit different box with how in our face the risk is right now. And so I think a lot of the struggle we're having, like in Del Mar and Imperial Beach and other places, is many of the real estate and property interests don't even want to talk about the risk, let alone have a policy that requires it to be recorded on a document that there's a hazard here, for example, because it'll affect the property value. Well, that's the whole point. One of the first steps towards getting managed retreat in place is to get the incentives worked out correctly. I know we're running up against the clock here, but that's one example, I think, to going to the question where maybe the state legislature could specifically require real estate disclosures about these kinds of hazards, even though that's already routinely done by the Coastal Commission on all of their permits.
No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, we are at an hour, but there are 3 more questions at least. Can we get to like 3 more questions? Do you have time, or do you have to?
Oh, I have time, but that reminded me of one footnote on the LCP question, which is the implications of if we actually finish them all out, and most of them are done. The implications of LCPs are that about 85% of our coast is above the mean high tide, is governed in the first instance by local government under LCPs. What that means is it's really important that groups like Surfrider and citizen activists and community members pay attention to what's going on in local government, because you're going to need to make sure they're following the LCP. You're going to need to file appeals when they aren't, and that's the whole point. But that's the implication, is that it's not the Coastal Commission. They're just out front on the big bad battles that continue to animate this process. But most of the permits, at least 2/3 of the permits, are issued by local governments.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Let's see which one I want to do next. Oh, there's one interesting one on climate change. If we move towards less auto-centric transportation, and I guess towards more mass transportation to address climate change, do you think we're adequately providing for non-car access? I feel like there's too much requirement for auto access at many places of the coast. What do you see for the future as far as that?
Yeah, that's a great question too. We used to get a lot of pushback sometimes from local governments saying the Coastal Commission just cares about parking. That's all they ever pay attention to. And there's some truth to that, right? That there was a lot of concern about making sure that our automobile-centric society could park at our beaches. Of course, now it seems like half the things we're trying to fix along the coastline are parking lots that are falling into the ocean. And so we've got a real problem there. Personally, I'm of the mind that we need to continue to make different kinds of balances so that we incorporate policies that de-incentivize single automobile use for sure, and require transportation options that are not that. The Coastal Commission has done that since the beginning, really. In the 70s, there was a lot of transportation planning going on. They required, for example, a satellite parking lot and a shuttle program in Santa Cruz, and they've done that in some other communities. But Americans have not, to date, really wanted to take advantage of those kinds of programs unless they're really well implemented. But I think we're going to have to do more of that. We're going to move our parking away from the immediate shoreline and also provide these other alternatives. But I think one of the reasons I brought up this question about housing and the original vision of the coastline being, or the coastal zone being accessible to everyone in the sense that you could live there, is because there is a real difference between who's able to live in the coastal zone and who isn't. And part of that is an access question. So if you live within a few blocks of the shoreline, you can just walk to the coastline. You don't need a car, you don't need to park. You just go there, you ride your bike. If you're in inland LA somewhere, it takes forever to get to the coastline without a car, right? Even if you're on the best public transit, it's not easy to do. And so is that the best way to optimize access to the beach, by providing a better transportation system? It's not going to complete the job. And so how do we imagine an access system that would actually enable more and a broader distribution of society to be at the shoreline? Those are, bigger issues than the Coastal Act, right? It's going back to, do we think it's important that everybody gets to live along the coast? And how would we do that if it is important?
Yeah, that environmental justice aspect is really important.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. You stated that the Coastal Act promised protection for existing development. Does that include existing fossil fuel operations such as oil wells and gas storage operations, and or any guarantees that the owners of mineral rights could not be prevented from extracting oil and gas in the coastal zone?
No, I guess off the top of my head, I'd say no, that doesn't, that would be a different kind of problem. And so the provision I'm talking about was specifically about erosion risk, and making the statement that if you were existing, and there's a whole debate that some of you are aware of about, well, what does existing mean? But in my simple mind, when the law was passed, it meant you were existing when the law was passed. Then if you were in existence on a coastal bluff, for example, in 1976, and now you're in danger from erosion, you are entitled to protect yourself if you can show that there's no other reasonable alternative and you've mitigated your impacts. So that was the case with that Ocean Harbor House photo I showed. That was a late 1960s condominium development. So vested in the sense that we really had to give them the seawall because there was no other way to protect that development. We tried, between you and me, we tried at the staff level to force the alternative of relocating the first row of condominiums, but the lawyers kind of held us back on that. So that's what that provision is concerning. Oil development, you know, if you had an oil development that was in danger from erosion, that provision would apply. But if it's just an ongoing activity, it's not necessarily protected. But the Coastal Act really operates around the idea of development. So in order for it to come into play, you have to have some activity that's considered to be development. So an ongoing oil production facility, there's no permit, there's no way for the Coastal Commission to get its hands on that unless there's something happening that triggers the need for a permit or a violation of a prior permit. That can also be a handle.
Gotcha, thank you. A few years ago, I was one of the hundreds of people who went up to the Coastal Commission hearing in Morro Bay to support you. And rather than touching on that, I was wondering if you could maybe take a moment to talk about the Ocean and Coastal Policy Center at the Marine Science Institute at UCSB and what you're doing currently.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about.
The raw deal you got at the Coastal Commission, I guess, in short, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming up and being there. That was quite a day, quite a few months. You know, someday maybe I'll write some reflections on it. But one thing I will say about it is that you know, I felt like I had to do what I did, and one of the core reasons for success of our coastal program in California has always been the engagement of the citizens. And so this was a situation in my mind where it was really it wasn't about me per se. I just happened to be in that place at the time. It was about the Coastal Act and how the Coastal Act was being implemented. And I think the public really came out and showed what it cared about on that day in terms of the values of what the law is trying to realize. So what I'm doing now is I have an opportunity to continue thinking about coastal policy and law and politics at UC Santa Barbara. And as Denise mentioned, I'm in the Marine Science Institute, but sort of rebooting a center. They've had a center there for ocean and coastal policy for 30 years or so. And so I'm sort of rebooting it. It hasn't been active in the most recent years. And still developing a research program a little bit, but mostly focused on things that I'm still animated by, like these questions we talked about tonight. To me, I've always been really drawn to this the idea of the coast and protecting it for everyone and for future generations. But the challenge is, well, how do you do that? And this interaction between all of us at the different levels of government and the different kinds of stakeholder interests and the tensions between private and public interests. And so that's always been a core concern of mine. And now I'm just doing that kind of thing in a different venue, different form. I also like working with students, so hopefully we'll have an opportunity to develop some student projects. I saw in the introduction somewhere a reference to professor. I'm not a professor. I'm a researcher technically, so I don't have a teaching obligation. But I also am trying to stay involved in advising policy questions and bodies where opportunities come up. So like the task force with Surfrider was something that was great to participate in and bring my knowledge and experience to a current problem that's ongoing from a different place.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for staying involved with Surfrider and be part of that. We really appreciate it. I do see one more question. It's a little detailed, so maybe we'll follow up with that one on email. And before we wrap up, Denise, do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap it?
I just wanted to thank everybody for being on this very informative Zoom call, and to thank Dr. Lester for appeasing us and working with us to put the program together for tonight. I too was up at the meeting, the doomed meeting, and it was a sad day for our chapter and for the Earth personally. Yes, but we look forward to working with you, bigger and better things, and just wanted to thank you again for all your insight tonight, and looking forward to working with you ongoing in the future.
Thank you. There's so much more to talk about, but you guys keep up the good fight.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks, Denise. And thanks again, Dr. Lester. We appreciate your time. And stay safe up there in Santa Cruz, and hope to see you down at Santa Barbara sometime soon.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Good night.